Good evening. I think we've given everybody a chance to pull themselves away from that splendid exhibit and come in here. I want to welcome you to the first Library Society program of the season and begin with a warm thank you to Anne Knaufel, the library's new bibliographer for religion and philosophy, for her tour of the exhibit Swiss Treasures. If you missed that tour, don't miss it before it leaves in December. It is a splendid collection that is on tour in the sense that it has come from Switzerland, a collection of Bibles mostly that have not seen the air of Chicago ever before and probably won't ever again. So this is your chance. The Swiss treasures of that exhibit come from some collections in Europe of remarkable depth and antiquity. Tonight's talk centers around a treasure from our own remarkable special collections. As to how antique the treasure is, well, you have to stay and learn. Our speaker is Margaret Mitchell, the Dean and Shaler Matthews Professor of New Testament and Early Christian Literature. Margaret's association with the university, as we've learned to describe ourselves, the university, goes back 3 decades to her arrival as a graduate student. After receiving her master's and PhD with distinction, she taught at the McCormick Theological Seminary before joining the Divinity School faculty in 1998. Her research is concentrated on early Christianity with an emphasis on literary and cultural history. Tonight, she will exhibit another side of her talents, forensic science. In recent work, she brought her literary skills together with a team that reached as far as Argonne Labs, and you will hear the remarkable story of one of the University of Chicago's own biblical manuscripts in the Goodspeed Bible collection called Archaic Mark. The entire team's effort was required to determine once and for all whether this miniature codex is a valuable 14th-century manuscript of the Gospel according to Mark or a clever forgery. I am pleased to welcome Margaret Mitchell to the podium for her talk, The University of Chicago's Archaic Mark MS 972, a remarkable manuscript treasure or a modern-day counterfeit. Margaret.
What a wonderful introduction, Steve. Thank you so much. And what a pleasure it is both to be among this company. I am a member of the Library Society, and I believe very much in the work that we do. And the story I'm going to tell could be told in a variety of ways, and I will tell it to some degree as a mystery story and as a story of record of research, but in some ways it's really a love story, and it's a love story of me with Regenstein Library and in particular special collections. I first saw this manuscript when I was a master's level student, first learning my Greek paradigms when it was shown to me, and it has been a preoccupation of mine for 3 decades. And I'm really delighted to share with you the research, and in particular the research process. There is a hero to this story, as I'll show you in a minute, and it's not me. I just happen to be the romantic who's involved in it. So, first, just in terms of basic facts, University of Chicago Manuscript 972, it goes by that name in our own catalog of the Goodspeed Bible manuscript collection, which numbers 68 manuscripts. This is a codex. It's a miniature codex. You can see the dimensions. They're not completely regular, but roughly 11.5 by 8.5 centimeters. It is 44 folios with 5 quires of 8, last quire of 4. It has the full Greek text of the Gospel according to Mark. The line amounts per page vary from 21 to 25. The handwriting is tiny, cramped, as I'll show you in a moment. It is an illuminated manuscript. It contains 16 narrative sequence images and 1 author portrait at the opening. It also has some other ornamental motifs, such as a headpiece on the second folio on the recto, and outside initials in gold, sometimes, and in other pigments, such as red or blue. It does not contain euthalian matter or paratextual reading aids. You may not know what that is, but in the late antique and into the Byzantine period, early Christian textual scholars developed, meaning to the side of the text, aids to help them to read the text. And so they include an early synopsis system whereby the pericope, or the passage of the baptism of Jesus, is cross-referenced from one gospel to another. They also contain such things as little synopses or plot prefaces, or little biographical narratives that precede the material. It's like an ancient study Bible, so that one doesn't come to the text without some kind of framing. But this manuscript, as you will see just from one page opening here, this manuscript, this is the tiny cramped hand, which you heard me mention. It is very difficult to read unassisted, and we'll talk about that in a minute in terms of what digitization has allowed us to do. That also raises questions about who could read it and in what circumstances, and we can discuss that further. But when I say it has no euthalian matter, what I mean is that there's no concordance or no attempt at cross-referencing in the margins. There are no notes, but there are these ornamental motifs. So, the manuscript represents a codicological enigma. Is it a 14th century, quote, original, which is a funny name for a manuscript in a sense, because a manuscript, almost by definition, is a copied artifact. We don't have autographs of any biblical text, of course. We're not even close to that. But nonetheless, is it an original, that is, original Byzantine manuscript, or is it a 19th century forgery? So that's our question. When I came to this manuscript, one of the reasons that our forebears, Edgar Johnson Goodspeed, for whom the manuscript collection in our university is named, received the first PhD from the University of Chicago Divinity School in 1898. After he graduated, he was immediately hired onto the faculty. He had come here with William Rainey Harper from Yale, and Harper sent him to the Holy Land to study before coming back in order to join the faculty. The Holy Land, of course, being Germany, where where he heard lectures of Adolf von Harnack and others, but also was sent to Europe, among other things, to collect manuscripts. Remember that our university was a relatively new university, and our scholars knew that to put us on the map, that they needed to have an impressive library. And one of the things that Goodspeed used to say is that manuscripts are to New Testament studies what lab materials are to the biological sciences and the physical sciences. So we needed manuscripts to put us on the map and to enable us to engage in original research. So this Codex, and I'll tell you a little bit about its history with the university in a moment, but one of the reasons it gained prominence immediately when it surfaced here in Chicago in 1937 was that when they quickly read it as they were able, and it's not impossible to read with the naked eye by any means, but there are some readings that are very tough to pull out because the ligatures, that is, the cursive script of the manuscript, and it's very small. But nonetheless, they figured out very early on that it contains the text of the Gospel of Mark in a primitive form. It has the highest degree of correspondence with Codex Vaticanus, which is Codex 1209, which is held by the Vatican Library, and we'll tell more about it. It will resurface in our story. The Vatican Library didn't allow full access to the manuscript until, as you will see in a moment, in the late 18th and 19th century when we start to get the readings of it. But it was, by the time the Chicago scholars looked at Archaic Mark, it had been published in various forms, and it's one of the most precious witnesses to all of the New Testament and the Gospel of Mark within it. It's a 4th century codex, and here was this little mini codex that appeared possibly to be a Byzantine codex, how did it have the closest correspondence to the 4th century Codex Vaticanus of any manuscript in existence? That was the question. And so it was, by some of the great text critical scholars of the previous generation and our own, held to be of a category 1 witness to the text of the New Testament of very highest text critical worth. And so it was included among the witnesses for the text of the Gospel of Mark in the critical edition of the New Testament, the Nestle-Aland 27th edition. Here, just to give you a sense of the Codex Vaticanus without being able to read it, what you can see is that as codices go, it's of a very different type than our Archaic Mark. It is an uncial manuscript with all capital letters. It is a magnificent ornamented, and as you can see with full capital letters, this is a text, and of course if I could show you dimensions, that was carried and that was used and read in public assembly. So the Archaic Mark obviously is not of that dimension, and yet it too is a text of the Gospel of Mark. So for scholars of the New Testament who generally use the critical edition, the Nestle-Aland Novum Testamentum Graece, that edition from 1993, when you look in the back under the witnesses, that is the manuscripts. Manuscripts are called witnesses because they give testimony to particular readings. And I mean here now, I'm not talking about translation at all. I'm talking about what are the Greek words that they think were the original Greek words or the earliest recoverable Greek words of the text that is the Gospel of Mark. And here in the back, in the table of codexes, you see our manuscript. That they give it a different catalog number than the library does, than our library does, as you can see here. University of Chicago Library Manuscript 972, and look at the date. Now, if you're a scholar, you say, I want to take that question mark off. Right? I want to solve the enigma. I want to find out, you know, and part of that enigma is how the question mark got on there in the first place. And then the question is, for the next edition, can we resolve the question? And I will not be a spoiler in telling you that the Nestle-Aland 28th edition, which has just come out, our manuscript is no longer listed, and there isn't a question mark with a question mark, because we've solved the enigma. Very briefly, the history of acquisition and research is extremely complicated. I'm only going to highlight for you a few things. Edgar Johnson Goodspeed, once he started buying manuscripts for the University of Chicago, the word was out that Chicago is looking for biblical manuscripts. One of the reasons that we've put out tonight for your viewing the Rockefeller-McCormick Greek New Testament is because it was the first manuscript acquired by the University of Chicago. Goodspeed chanced to see it in an art dealer's office or shop in Paris in 1927 and brought it to the University of Chicago, and eventually it was purchased. It was so famous. It was only the third manuscript of the Greek New Testament, Byzantine manuscript, that was within the Midwest at that time. There was one at Newberry Library and one in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan. They held cocktail parties for it on the North Shore here in Chicago, welcoming the Rockefeller-McCormick. So the word got out. Chicago is looking for manuscripts. And so Goodspeed received a letter from Gregory Vlastos in 1935 offering a manuscript for sale by his cousins in Greece. And one of the reasons it's hard to trace this history is because there are all kinds of tariff laws about manuscripts and about antiquities, as you know, not quite as strict as they now are, even back then. But it looks as though they were trying to submerge some of the full history of acquisition. But at any rate, the manuscript arrived in Chicago sometime between February and June of 1937. And a couple of my students are here, and I want you guys to have a vision of this, that Goodspeed was famous for going past the mailroom on his way to his seminar. You know, our seminar room 403, the Early Christian Archaeology Seminar, taking the crate that had arrived from Europe and going into the classroom with a crowbar and opening up the box and letting his students have the first look at a manuscript that had just arrived. And so when I think of this history, I imagine Goodspeed and his students opening the package to see this archaic mark. And this would have been a smaller package. I hope they used a small crowbar. It was purchased in or around 1941 by the university, and Chicago scholars Willoughby and Goodspeed agreed on the name Archaic Mark. By that, they meant to encapsulate the mystery to some degree, and also, I think, to give it a certain cachet. So it's archaic, which could mean it's really, really old. And they don't mean by that that it's from the 6th century, but they mean that its text type represents a very old type. Or is it archaic as in archaizing? In other words, is it pretending to be ancient, but is not itself? They planned an edition from the U of C Press, which would have contained a facsimile, a study of the iconography, a study of the text. It was never completed. And one of the questions I have as I've compiled and searched all the correspondence about this is, to what degree were people possibly dragging their feet because they were not so sure, they wanted to go into public, that they had some doubts about the manuscript? That's one part of the story. Another part of the story is I think there was inner scholarly contention among the partners in the team, and that I think was as well. Now, there were studies of the manuscript, in particular by Orna et al. In 1989 that I'll tell you about, where what they did is they tested the pigmentation on some of the miniatures to try to see if this manuscript could potentially be authentic. I'm going to say more about that in a minute. I saw it. Here I am. This is my love story. As an MA student, and was intrigued by it. And then when I was on the faculty in 2003 to 2004, I applied for and received a Provost Academic Technology Award to digitize the manuscript, to make it available to my class, to teach a class around the manuscript, and to work on the questions of its authenticity. Out of that work, we published the digital images online together with my research assistant, Patricia Duncan, who's an advanced PhD student here at the University of Chicago. We published a collation of the text, and we put out to the scholarly world everything that was known about this manuscript until that moment in 2006. We did not attempt to solve the question. We didn't come out one way or another. We called for further testing on all aspects of the Codex. And then with great leadership, for which I'm inexpressibly grateful, Al Schreier, then director of the Special Collections Research Center, took this problem as one that was significant enough to the library to form a task force for it. And so here what you have is Team Archaic Mark, members of whom are here tonight, such as Dan Meyer. Who else is here from the team? Dan, give a wave. Come on, there you are. Dan's here. And others. Patty Gibbons, Al Schreier told me she couldn't be here tonight, and Lindsay, Judith Dart, Beth Bidlack. And then we were able to fundraise a bit, and also joint contributions from the library and from the Divinity School. We hired Joseph Barabee from the McCrone Labs in Westmont, Illinois, to carry out some high-level spectrographic and other testing on the manuscript. Because we knew that whatever else you do, you've got to test the materials. Now I'm going to set up the problem and show you a little bit about how it comes in. And then Abigail Quant, who is a great codicologist and scholar of Byzantine manuscripts, who's at the Walter Art Museum. If you've heard of the Archimedes Project, which reconstructed a treatise of Archimedes from a palimpsest, she was at the heart of that project. We were lucky that she got interested in this one, and she came on board the team. So the hero of this story is teamwork. We could not have solved the problem without all of the various partners who are involved. Okay, so let me just give you a little sense of what a manuscript is. A manuscript is a complex physical object. It contains a range of things that need to be tested, and the data that we learn about each of them is interpenetrated with the others. It is a physical object with certain physical properties. It is also a codex that was fashioned using certain techniques. The paleography, that is the handwriting of the manuscript, is also something that can be tested and can be dated within relative range of certainty. Our manuscript, for example, uses a system of abbreviations which can be tested and can be placed. Text critically, the question of if it isn't what it if it isn't a genuine Byzantine manuscript, then how did it come to have the closest readings to Vaticanus of any other manuscript? And that becomes a detective question of where else in printed editions of the Greek New Testament could it have gotten those readings? That means comparing the Greek words, so that's a different kind of skill than the others. Then iconographic, the art images that are in there. One of the things about Byzantine iconography is it's a stable form, tends not to be innovative, but tends on the whole to replicate certain patterns. So can we place the iconography within the history of the iconography of Greek New Testament manuscripts? And then bibliographic. So let me just quickly run through some of these questions. So the physical state and construction of the codex, does it fit what we would expect in a Byzantine manuscript? The paleography, I've mentioned that somewhat. Text critical evidence, iconographic tradition, and then some bibliographic questions that also interested me in particular as a New Testament scholar. Why was it only Mark? Mark, in fact, was not the most favored gospel through most of the history of Christianity. It became much more of interest in the 19th century when people started to try to discern lives of Jesus, and it was deemed to be the earliest gospel by source criticism. So why Mark, and why only Mark? And what kind of a text is this? And then we ask, who would have used it and for what purpose? As a luxury item, who could afford it, etc. Okay, so that's a setup of the questions. I'm going to fast forward ahead, and I'm going to show you the presentation slides from my colleague Joseph Barabee, who did the physical testing on the Codex. What I want to insist to you is that all 5 of these question layers are related to one another. Joe doesn't know what to test until we tell him what ought to be tested. I don't know what to test in terms of Byzantine manuscript manufactory until Abigail says, these are the things that would have been done. These are binding agents that are used in ink. Joe doesn't know what to test until Abigail says, are you finding sucrose? Are you finding whatever? So this is Joe's piece. This also has a teamwork component. Archaic Mark traveled from Regenstein Library in a car, in a seat belt, in a car, to Westmont, Illinois. And when we were there, this is part of the team, we prepared the manuscript for the sampling team to take their samples. Now, one of the things that I want you to know about the earlier analysis, and you're not going to have to, read the sine curves here, but the early analysis in 1989 did locate a particular Prussian blue pigment in several of the illuminations, that is, in the pictures that were in the manuscript, and that that pigment is from the 18th century. So you could have said, okay, case closed. But they thought the manuscript had been retouched. That is, they thought that someone had tipped in later an overlay on the original layer. So that alone doesn't solve the case. That's why you need more refined science. So we brought Archaic Mark in and we set it up for testing. The sampling of the materials was done under very, very high magnification. That allowed Joe and others at Macron to determine without question under high magnification that there was not retouching on the manuscript. So right away we knew when we were sampling from the manuscript that we were getting material that was all of one chronological spectrum, and that's of course a crucial issue, right? So then here, the first thing we sought to do, again, I'm talking about a complex physical object, is to test the parchment platform. This is parchment, this is animal skin, and what they sought to do was some carbon dating. Regenstein Library, you'll be pleased to know, in special collections, was extremely careful about just not trying to destroy anything more than we needed to on the Codex. Its value was to be retained. And so you can see here that they just took a little tiny snippet from the edge of one of the places where we actually had a fold on the parchment in order to test it. Actually, Macron Labs is a spectrography lab. They don't do carbon testing themselves. It was sent to Arizona, and voila, this was the findings from the first level of testing on the parchment itself, that by radiocarbon dating, it was between the 15th and the 17th centuries. Now, once again, we don't stop there, right? Why? Because the parchment itself is the base for the complex object that's on top of it, which contains paint, ink, layers of coating, and other things. So we asked, can we be more precise? And also, we had done the testing all at the same moment. We didn't wait for the carbon dating to go further. So, but we did know that the parchment itself was from between the 15th and the 17th centuries. It was really remarkable to see the kind of precision that this analysis was able to do so far ahead of 1989. They used a tungsten sharpened stylus in order to pluck little tiny pieces of the pigments. And what you're looking at here is, this is an author portrait of the evangelist Mark, a pretty standard looking author portrait. I say he kind of looks like he has a toothache here, the sort of the pose. But you can see the magnification on the face. Every single sample that was taken was accompanied by a photograph that marked precisely the spot on the Codex where the sample had been taken. So we knew, we had a full record of every sample, of every location. And this gives you some idea, again, this is a very small Codex, of the kind of precision that was required. So the first test that they did was on the blues, and they discovered exactly what the earlier study by Orna et al. Did, which is that we have a blue ink from Diesbach, which was first commercially produced in 1704 and went on sale by Colazios in 1722. So now we have another terminus from which, right, that it had to be after 1704 or 1722. But can we be more precise than that? Now, so what we've done thus far is we've confirmed a date for the parchment. We've confirmed that indeed the Prussian blue is present on the manuscript, and we've confirmed that it was original to the manuscript. So those are key findings. But can we do more? Well, we tested all of the pigments. I'm going to move ahead here. We tested the zinc white, and we did so, by the way, also using polarized light and ultraviolet fluorescence. What Joe was able to see is that there was some kind of a wash also on top of the pigments. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. The zinc white was tested, and the zinc white was found to have chemical properties that were usually produced on an industrial scale in 1845, though the material was first introduced in 1780. So that didn't itself fully lock down a lot further. It gave us another 70 years on top of the Diesbach, but can we go further? And then we had our eureka moment. The color cream in the face of Mark the Evangelist was tested, and the color cream was found to have a compound called lithopone, and lithopone was only available after 1874. So from the point of view of materials analysis, that is that our manuscript must have been created after 1874. And the reason I'm showing you, this level of photography, in addition to the impressive slides that Joe produced, is that you have to see how the magnification allows you to see the contemporaneity of the material. But of course, being able to do so visually is only one facet. So I want you to see something else that I think is really pretty remarkable. We also wanted to test the ink. And so, again, the university didn't want to deface the manuscript. And so I think one of my proudest scholarly moments of my career was that I was asked to find a place where we might punch a hole in the manuscript. And this is the one that I chose. And so this is the word trace, which means 3. And he was able to, again, with an extremely sharp instrument, was able to do a single punch that would capture all the layers of the codex. So this isn't just based on the naked eye here. So this is a magnified picture of the punched cross-section that Joe made. And this enabled us to see that inks, by the way, aren't just inks. Inks are always combined with bonding agents. So you have multiple layers. You have ink, you have the bonding agent. We were also able to determine that there are various coatings on our manuscript, and that became part of the detective work as well. So this level of detail into the physical properties is absolutely essential. The brown ink from the text, though, if we had started there, the brown ink from the text is actually a pretty common vanDyke brown, which could date any time from 1700 or so forward. So the ink alone, if we had just said, we're not doing comprehensive testing, we'll just go for the simplest thing, really would not have advanced what we were able to learn much further. So I'm going to advance on a few slides in here in interest of the time. And I want you to get a feel for, well, I want you to just see this. One of the things that we wound up talking a lot about was it was discovered that there was a glossy coating over the top of the whole codex. And there were various coatings between the parchment itself and either the inscription of text or the application of ink, or excuse me, of paint. And so our scientists and Byzantine manuscript specialists were really curious about these coatings and their place within the history of composition of manuscripts. It was earlier thought that it was an egg wash, but in fact our analysis showed that it was probably gelatin and not egg white, and I'll show you why that's important in a minute. Something else I want you to see is that what we were able to determine, Joe was able to determine under the magnification, is that there was some kind of beading on the edges of that coating. And again, now what we're trying to do is retrace the steps of the person who composed this. And apparently some wash was put on late in the process, and we could see how it was beaded up on the corners. This is even a better image of the same. What we also could see is that not only was there beading on the edges, but that there was what attempted to be a brown edging on the codex. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second as I move forward. So this is a summation of some of the materials analysis about the parchment, and then the paints, and of course our hero, lithopone, and then the ink and the coatings. One of the things we found is that the coating that was identified as being cellulose nitrate, one of the coatings over the paint was cellulose nitrate, which was used especially in the 1890s to solidify manuscripts that were disintegrating, that were flaking. As you can see, even when you see our Rockefeller McCormick, she doesn't come out often on dates because when we open the pages, the manuscript itself is susceptible to flaking. So the possibility was that someone later on tried to stabilize with the Zapon lac, but we found through our analysis, because of lithopone, that it's completely consistent in dating that the coating was original. So, Abigail Quant, whom I mentioned earlier, who works at the Walters Art Museum, studied the physical properties, both of the manuscript under her own personal analysis and then with the analysis that Joe provided, and she came to the following conclusions. The first is, she said, it's highly unlikely that someone would have just happened to have mid-16th century blank parchment lying around. So most likely what was the case is that this was a parchment that already had some kind of text on it, and that it had been scraped in order to remove it. And so she identified 2 places on the manuscript conclusively where you can, I don't know if you can see it from the distance, but you can see even a knife scrape here on the parchment itself, where they clearly were trying to expunge text. And we have a blank folio on the final folio 44. You can see that it's scored for text. We actually, Chad Hines in IT here at the University of Chicago, we did all kinds of photoshopping and playing with this to see if we could pull up what should be a colophon, and if it's a genuine manuscript. And the colophon ought to say, I, Monk Asterios, made this manuscript in this year, and, you know, as a sailor longs for the shore, so a scribe coming to the end of the book, or something like that. In fact, we couldn't pull up a text. What we think, but we could see a kappa and a few letters. What we think is that the counterfeiter probably wrote something and then scraped it off in order to lure us into thinking that there had originally been a colophon on the manuscript. Pretty tricky, huh? I'm going to move ahead on here. This the shiny coating. What Abigail discovered is that this shiny coating, this modern product, seems to have been applied not to preserve the manuscript, but perhaps to make it look dated, perhaps to give it a puckered appearance, and hence to add to the archaizing sense. Now, Abigail also gives you an image here of a genuine Byzantine manuscript, and what you can see is that manuscripts get dirty. They were read by candle and firelight. They have charred edges. They have soiled margins from the oil on human fingers. They also get mold damage. Rockefeller McCormick, when you look at it, has had some rat damage or mice damage. You can see that parchment's a living thing, and living creatures like to live inside living things, right? Our manuscript, however, according to Abigail's analysis, really doesn't have sweat stains, fingerprint stains, and it doesn't have a genuine wear pattern. What it does have is a fabricated wear pattern. So what we can see, and in fact the chemical components of the wear pattern on the side really are very close to the ink that was used to inscribe the manuscript. So it seems pretty clear that someone provided an edging for this. And then in terms of one of the other coatings, Abigail argued that this is really just starch turned into dextrin, so somebody could have just used Betty Crocker and heated it up on a hot plate and turned this into a modern coating. Again, you're not able to tell that date that precisely in and of itself, but from the technology of the manuscript production, you can. So you can see here the edging. On purpose, I've left my own piece for just a few quick minutes. The first step toward decoding the mystery of how this manuscript could be so close to Vaticanus was to provide scholars with a collation of the text, and that's what we did in our publication in 2006. But then what one needed to do, and we called for this in our article, was that text needed to be compared with existing printed editions of the Greek New Testament, and they needed to be compared on a timeline for when those appeared and when they would have been available to a forger. And so about 6 months after our article appeared, an independent scholar, Stephen Carlson, presented a paper at the Society of Biblical Literature meeting, picking up on our challenge, and expertly doing so, discovered that, and he argued, that Philip Buttman in the 1860 edition of the Greek New Testament, which he said was based on Cardinal Mai's edition, that this was what our forger used, was the edition from 1860, and he argued because of the closeness of our text to the Buttman edition. So I set out to test every Greek New Testament that we could alongside it to see if Carlson were right. Luckily, I'm at the University of Chicago, which has one of the world's great collections of printed Greek New Testaments, even without Erasmus coming to visit us as he has this month from Switzerland. So here's what I found, is it's really important to ask which Codex Vaticanus, because as I mentioned earlier, the Vatican Library didn't allow access fully to scholars to publish a full edition of Codex Vaticanus until late into the 19th century or mid-19th century. So if you lay this out, what you can see, though, is that various readings of Codex Vaticanus that were seen by scholars, written in marginalia of their own Greek New Testaments, eventually started to be published. And so what I sought to do was to figure out what did the forger know and what was in the different manuscripts, printed editions. One of the things right away that I knew, though, was that Carlson couldn't be fully right that Buttman was relying on Angelo Mai, because the first edition of Buttman was 1856, and Cardinal Mai's began to come out in 1857. So there had to be something wrong with that way of seeing the line of textual dependence. Now, Buttman is a very interesting figure because he was involved as an assistant in the production of one of the first works of critical textual scholarship on the Greek New Testament, and that is the Karl Lachmann edition of the Greek New Testament. And so Buttman himself was involved in that, and he then went on to publish his own, as I said, in 1856 edition of the Greek New Testament. But in the meantime, Cardinal Mai, as you saw on the previous slide, Cardinal Mai published in 1857 and 1859 the readings of Codex Vaticanus. So what are you going to do if you're Buttman? You've now published this Teubner edition, for you classicists in the audience, of the Greek New Testament, and now you have access to better manuscript readings. Well, Teubner didn't want him to alter the pages, so instead what he did in 1860 was he put out an editio altera et emendata, so he had an appendix of corrected readings. And it was here that I had my eureka moment, which is that the Philip Buttman edition of the Greek New Testament in 1856 reads here we're in Mark chapter 2. And he entered into the house of God during the period when Abiathar was high priest. The reading here, Elthan, he says is the reading of Codex Vaticanus B. And he says that post Eselthen is the reading of these other manuscripts. Our miniature Mark, Archaic Mark, has this reading. So how did they get this reading? Well, they had this reading because they did use the Buttman, but they didn't know how to use the addenda et corrigenda, where we see that the reading actually of Codex Vaticanus is Eselthen entered into rather than just Elthen entered into. So textual scholarship combined with materials analysis, combined with codicological analysis, has led to our conclusion, which I'm going to read in just a minute. So this is one example of multiple places where I've checked the entire Greek manuscript, of our manuscript over and against the Buttman edition. And also checked and rejected other options. So a conclusion. Manuscript 2427, also known as University of Chicago, Manuscript 972, is a modern production that was made sometime between 1874, the date of Lithopone, and the first decades of the 20th century, that is, sometime between then and purportedly 1917, when our manuscript was found, so the family said, in the possessions of one John Askitopoulos, who was an antiquities dealer in Athens. So sometime in that window, using parchment from around the mid-16th century, and was created deliberately to look as though it were a genuine Byzantine manuscript, using a modern Greek textual edition, the Buttman edition of 1860. However, that's not fully the end of the story. University of Chicago Special Collections Research Center has not thrown Archaic Mark out. We actually had some fun talk about what do you do to dethrone, take the stripes off a manuscript. Some people actually on blogs were saying, should we remove its Nesla Allen number? Sort of, that would be a way to sort of brand it. But instead, though, it's really a crucial tool now, and I think that our analysis together, which has been published in the journal Novum Testamentum, it's also been published in a chemical archaeology journal. We, the team, have lectured on this around the country at different scholarly specializations, that what we are doing with it is we are learning more about the techniques that were used to counterfeit medieval or antique materials in the early modern period. So for the detection of further forgeries, the work that we've done goes far further than just disproving the importance of this particular text for such questions as the original text of the Gospel according to Mark. So the hero of the story is teamwork. None of the scholars alone could have come to this full and comprehensive result. And this is what is needed when an artifactual item that is a physical object, which also has a text on it, which has a certain historical context and a codicological manufactory, all these questions need to be brought to bear to understanding the object. So thank you for your patience. I look forward to comments and questions.
Thank you very much. It's splendid talk. We have time for some questions, and we have a question.
Please. What does recension mean?
Recension? A recension is an addition.
Cups like that.
Where? Sorry, did I pass it by?
No, it's in there.
Recension.
There it is.
Yeah, it's really kind of the wrong word. It should be addition. Usually, a textual recension is a particular textual tradition of a text. So a recension can be when a text is translated into another language, for example, right? So the Targumim represent a recension of Hebrew Bible texts. But it's his quote.
Was there some, I must have missed it, was there something in the book itself that sort of said, hey, I'm from the 14th century, that you were seeking to disprove, or simply, who placed it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And if you don't mind, I remember I blew the ending, which is I was supposed to show you this. That this is how small the object is that we're describing. The antiquity of it really has to do with the fact that I need to supply another piece of information. The overwhelming majority of Byzantine manuscripts that we have for the New Testament don't follow Vaticanus as systematically as this manuscript did, which meant that it stands out for being so close to an earlier text type as represented in Sinaiticus. That's number one. Then number two, and this is kind of interesting for me because I think there was an allure to it. I mean, I think that when they got intrigued by its peculiarities in terms of the abbreviations that it used and other things, and they being the Chicago scholars, and they thought the peculiarities could speak to greater antiquity rather than the counter. with scholarly work, right, you develop a hypothesis and you then assemble and evaluate the evidence according to it. Now, I look at the abbreviation scheme, and I also look at, a fact that even a first-year Greek student ought to know, which is that there's space between the words. There isn't space between the words in all minuscule manuscripts which are written in cursive or not to that degree. There is some, however. So again, what you're talking about is weighing of the evidence over and against it. I also think, in some sense, and I don't think I've made this argument, I certainly haven't made it in print, but I'll say it here, I think this manuscript got a lot more attention because it's illustrated. I think that the images really drew people's attention. I will also tell you, and Dan can tell you, that we on the Archaic Mark team, that it's a really neat little object. When I taught my course on digital mark, which was in the spring of 2004 or 5, I had students emailing me saying, "Sorry, I can't make it to class, but say hi to Archaic Mark for me." They sort of got intrigued and drawn in by it. It's a kind of seductive object in the sense that if it could be what we think it is, it's really neat. Now, I'm happy to draw other inferences about the problem with if it could be what we think it is, being a scholarly argument. But.
Another question before
Betsy.
Yes, who do you think had the skill to make it? That is a marvelous object.
Yeah.
Never mind that it was made in 1890.
Yeah.
And if there was a group of people who could have made this, they could have made others. Just like the Italian
Yes.
forgers of the 19th century, that you can identify, the workshop of Giuseppe so-and-so.
That's correct.
And I wondered if you'd gone that far with this one.
Well, there's another manuscript in the Hermitage museum that some have that in a footnote in an earlier article someone said could have been done by the same forger. And I have argued that I don't think it could be, for one reason, because the text type is totally different. For another, the orthography is quite different. So on the other hand, again, having emphasized to you repeatedly, this is a composite object, this probably wasn't made by just the same person. So the person who did the text maybe wasn't the person who did the images, so now you're talking about a workshop. Right, and if you're talking about a workshop, you are talking about more products from that workshop. Now, there's a very famous forger, Simonides, in the late 19th and into the early 20th century, who not only created forgeries of papyri, I think he has forgeries of like Iliad papyri and things like that, but he also, in an inverse to forgery, claimed that he forged Codex Sinaiticus, which is a 4th century grand codex. So once you destabilize genuineness, there's room for all kinds of nefarious activity. But I do think that the quality of this, we may know, for example, what models were used for some of the iconography. A volume published by Henri Aumont that has some black and white images from genuine Byzantine manuscripts that may have been used by the forger. If we can trust some of the family history here, which is very difficult, it was made either in Greece or it was made in Turkey. That's as far as the historical threads will allow us to go, and that's probably consistent with the skill base. Oh, I forgot another thing. There are a few places in the Greek text. Not everything can be explained by Buttman. That's one of the reasons I needed to go test the Buttman hypothesis. And one of the things that can't fully be explained is there are a few modern Greekisms. Once you start asking, so I think it's a modern Greek speaker who also knows the Greek New Testament because the author, the scribe has enough gospel harmony to have inserted a Matthean or a Lucan allusion. But just another example is that he transposes from Buttman readily known Greek prepositions. So apo and ek, he switches in and out. And so it's pretty clear that he's thinking in Greek, probably as a modern Greek.
One last question before others can ask at the reception. We'll have time.
I wondered what this method of analysis might say about the papyrus fragment that Karen King wrote about and has been talking about, that got so much publicity a few months ago.
Yes. I actually backloaded a few slides on that, but you have a slide after me. So, and dinner is served at 11:30, right? Are we clear on that? On September the 17th, Karen King, the Hollis Professor of Ecclesiastical History at Harvard Divinity School, gave a press conference to AP, the Boston Globe, and the New York Times, and showed them they keep saying the size of a business card, which is rather a telling thing, I think. But anyway, the size of a business card, 33 words, Coptic papyrus fragment, with a highlight on one particular phrase, which is "my wife" in Coptic. Professor King had written an article that at that time had been accepted by Harvard Theological Review, in which she named the text the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, and she was very clear about two things up front. One, that we don't know for certain about its authenticity, but the rest of the article works on the assumption that it is genuine, and if so, this is what it means. Secondly, she emphasized this isn't about Jesus. This is about early Christians from the late 2nd century. She herself, together with Roger Bagnall of NYU, is dating the Codex, the fragment, probably roughly 4th century, but she thinks it was a copy of a text that was composed near the end of the 2nd century, contemporaneous with texts like the Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Thomas, perhaps, and others. Subsequent to that, she produced a paper at the Codicological Conference in Rome, and boy, it's great for scholars to have text messaging and email, because I was hearing on a 15-minute basis from people who were there in Rome, because I wasn't there, about what the discussion was. To this day, no one else has come forward saying they think it's genuine, and a lot of scholars have said they don't think that it is genuine. Now, what do I mean by genuine? Again, I mentioned earlier when we're talking about an original, I mean, if it's a copy of a copy, that can still be original in the sense that it's an authentic ancient text. What people are questioning is whether this is an ancient text. So a whole group of people are saying, well, for one thing, the word in question is darker print than the other words, which sort of raises a little bit of suspicion. Others are saying that the form of the letters and the thickness of the ink appears suspicious. There's a whole series of arguments like that. There are other arguments having to do with the linguistics of the Coptic linguistics, and some are saying that, that there are irregularities that one would not expect. Yet others have done the kind of operation I was describing on the text, and they believe that they have found a mistake in a Coptic English interlinear online version of the Gospel of Thomas that's been replicated in the fragment. So that's, again, an argument of a different type of finding the exemplar of someone who perhaps fabricated the object. Again, we don't know, but that the physical testing needs to be done, that it should, I think, have been done earlier on in the process, is my own opinion, that this can and should be done. I also, just since you asked, I don't think we have, even if it is an authentic ancient piece, which I have real suspicions based on the various arguments I have seen, but even if it is, it's not at all clear to me that it should be deemed a gospel. Early Christians wrote all kinds of literature. It could be a magical spell, it could be a prayer, it could be a number of things, but to call it a gospel is certainly premature on the basis of 33 words, and is intentionally, I think, provocative in terms of entering, giving this text a kind of authority of a gospel. It's also not clear to me that Jesus' wife is, as is claimed, the most important word in the fragment. I mean, or let alone in the whole work of which it's a part. So there's a series of interpretive decisions that have been made that, and I want to be clear that these can be questioned on different grounds with different kinds of evidence. But the physical materials need to be tested, and if this talk has been helpful in thinking about that, this could be an ancient papyrus. But that doesn't tell you that this is an authentically ancient text. We need full-scale materials analysis. And maybe after the talk tonight, you're thinking, but what about the coatings? And what about the edgings, right? I mean, so that obviously does need to be done in order to authenticate that. And I think it's crucially important that we scholars, when we introduce new materials into the scholarly discussion, and let alone the popular discussion, I think it's very, very important that that we do the most careful analysis that we can up front.
Thank you very much. Now I have two more duties to perform here. The first is to officially, on behalf of the Library Society, to thank Dean Mitchell. It is the Library Society's tradition to present a title selected by the bibliographers to be added to the library's collection to commemorate our guest speaker. I am pleased to present a symbolic book plate that goes with this book called The Unity of Christ, Continuity and Conflict in Patristic Tradition. The book plate thanks Margaret Mitchell on the occasion of her talk, The Archaic Mark. And that you get to keep. This you can look at before the bibliographer's take. But please accept our deep appreciation for your splendid presentation on a mystery of truly biblical proportions. Now, as many of you know, we have this year introduced a practice at each meeting of the Library Society of exhibiting some treasure from our collections as a one-night special exhibit for members of this society, just for the society. These exhibits will not necessarily bear any relationship to the talk. The first two such exhibits did not. But tonight, we could not resist choosing as the special exhibit the manuscript that was the subject of the talk we heard, the Archaic Mark itself. It will be displayed in the Rosenthal Seminar Room together with the Rockefeller McCormick manuscript during the reception. And I'm going to say this again in a minute. Do not take wine or food in there. We don't want to have to subject this to testing as to whether it was Merlot or Chardonnay. Now, before we adjourn this reception, I want to give a short postscript to a special exhibit that was presented at the last meeting. Can I get that other picture up here? Do I just go to the next one? Beautiful. That exhibit consisted of some early circular statistical graphics, including this one from an 1852 book by William Farr on a cholera epidemic in London in the 1840s. You can see the incidence of cholera and deaths are during the seasons are shown on a circle for each year, and you can follow and see what seasons it was not safe to drink the water. Although at that time they didn't know the full cause. Now at the time that we presented this, I noted that the book had been given to the library by Ronald Coase, the winner of the 1991 Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on social cost. That was a chance encounter. That it was his book, and thinking that he might be interested in the surprising use that we'd made of his book, I sent the handout with a picture of this and a letter to Ronald, who's living on the north side of Chicago. He's going to be 102 years old in December. In July, he wrote me a handwritten letter, which I have here, not very formal, but a handwritten letter commenting on why he had acquired that book and why he had never used it in his work. I want to read you just a small portion of that letter. Dear Steve, thank you for your letter. I was going to write an article on London's water supply, but then the war came along, and I spent my time gathering statistics on rifles, guns, tanks, ammunition, and such like in the Cabinet Office. I tried to show where the mistakes were made in allocating these war supplies to the various theaters of war, but these reports were stopped after about 3 months. They showed where the mistakes were made, and nobody wanted this to happen. It might be your turn in the future. So the only reports Churchill received were of successes. Of course, Churchill knew this and had a section under Lindemann, later Lord Sherwell, which tried to find out what was really going on. Were they hated? Now that's Ronald's recollections. Laura Ring, just an aside, you might take this as an example of the difficulties of collecting data in times of strife. Now, I want to invite all of you to the reception and to visit the Archaic Mark itself. Don't sign it, don't feel it needs more annotations, but do admire it and the other earlier and authentic manuscript that is also on exhibit. Thank you very much.